The summer of 1851 descended upon Kentucky like a suffocating blanket, trapping the humid air between the tobacco leaves and corn stalks that stretched endlessly across the Whitmore plantation. Margaret wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her calloused hand, her dark skin glistening under the merciless sun as she bent over the cotton rows. The fabric of her worn dress clung to her thin frame, each movement a reminder of the iron shackles that had been removed from her ankles only months ago, though the invisible chains remained as heavy as ever. At 23, Margaret carried herself with a quiet dignity that unnerved the overseers. Her eyes, deep brown and unwavering, held secrets that no amount of beatings had managed to extract. The scars on her back told stories of defiance, each raised line a testament to her refusal to break completely under Master Jonathan Whitmore's cruel hand. "Margaret, get over here, girl!" The voice of Samuel Whitmore, Jonathan's younger brother, cut through the afternoon heat like a whip crack. She straightened slowly, her spine protesting after hours of bent labor, and made her way toward the main house where the two brothers stood on the wraparound porch. Jonathan Whitmore was a man whose cruelty had become legendary even among the plantation owners of Jefferson County. His pale blue eyes held no warmth, and his thin lips seemed permanently curved in a sneer of disdain. At 35, he had inherited the plantation from their father and had immediately set about making it the most feared estate in the region. Samuel, 3 years younger, was cut from the same cloth, perhaps even more vicious in his appetites, using his position to satisfy desires that would have made even hardened men turn away in disgust. "Yes, Master Whitmore," Margaret said, her voice steady, despite the fear that coiled in her stomach like a serpent. Jonathan's eyes raked over her with the same calculating look he might give a horse he was considering purchasing. "You've been talking to the other slaves again, haven't you? Filling their heads with ideas above their station." Margaret kept her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. "No, sir. I keep to myself." Samuel stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. "Don't lie to us, girl. Old Moses heard you talking about reading. You know what happens to slaves who get ideas about learning." Adil, the memory of the last slave who had been caught with a book, flashed through Margaret's mind. The man had been sold south to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, a fate worse than death. But Margaret had learned to read in secret, taught by the previous master's daughter, before the girl had died of consumption. It was her one rebellion, her one window into a world beyond the boundaries of the plantation. "I don't know nothing about reading, Master Samuel," she lied smoothly. Jonathan descended the steps slowly, each footfall deliberate and menacing. "We'll see about that. Samuel and I have been discussing your attitude problem. It seems you need a reminder of your place in this world." The brothers exchanged a look that made Margaret's blood run cold. She had seen that look before, had witnessed what followed when the Whitmore men decided a slave needed special attention. The screams that had echoed from the old tobacco barn still haunted her dreams. "Tonight," Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout, "you'll come to the barn after the evening bell. We're going to have ourselves a little conversation about respect and obedience." Margaret's hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to nod. "Yes, Master." As she turned to walk away, Samuel's voice followed her like a shadow. "And Margaret, don't even think about running. You know what happened to the last one who tried." She did know. The bloodhounds had brought back pieces. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Margaret of fire and blood, she sat in the slave quarters, listening to the familiar sounds of her people settling in for another night of exhausted sleep. Children whispered to their mothers, old men groaned as they settled their aching bones onto straw mattresses, and somewhere in the distance, a woman hummed a spiritual that spoke of deliverance and freedom. Margaret's friend Celia, a woman of 40 who had been on the plantation since childhood, sat beside her on the rough wooden bench outside their shared cabin. "You don't have to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening chorus of crickets and tree frogs. "Yes, I do," Margaret replied, her fingers unconsciously tracing the newest scar on her forearm, a reminder of her last conversation with the Whitmore brothers. "If I don't, they'll take it out on everyone else." Celia's weathered hand found Margaret's and squeezed gently. "There's got to be another way, child. This can't go on forever." But Margaret knew better. She had seen too much, endured too much, to believe in the fairy tales of rescue or escape that some of the younger slaves still whispered about. The Underground Railroad was a myth in this part of Kentucky, and the few abolitionists who dared to operate in the area were quickly silenced by men like the Whitmores. As the evening bell tolled across the plantation, its bronze voice carrying the weight of countless nights of suffering, Margaret stood and smoothed her dress. She had made a decision in the depths of her heart, a choice that would either free her or damn her, but either way, it would end the cycle of humiliation and pain that had defined her existence. "Pray for me, Celia," she whispered as she began walking toward the old tobacco barn, its weathered walls looming like a monument to cruelty in the gathering darkness. Behind her, Celia's voice rose in a barely audible spiritual, "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming to carry me home." The words followed Margaret as she approached the barn, where lamplight flickered through the gaps in the wooden walls, and the shadows of two men waited to continue a ritual of degradation that had gone on for far too long. But tonight would be different. Tonight, Margaret carried something more than fear in her heart. She carried the cold, sharp edge of a decision that would change everything. The barn door creaked open, and Margaret stepped into the amber glow of the oil lamps, where Jonathan and Samuel Whitmore waited with the patient hunger of predators who had cornered their prey. The interior of the tobacco barn reeked of dried leaves and old sweat, a sickly sweet smell that had become synonymous with terror for every slave on the Whitmore plantation. Wooden beams stretched overhead like the ribs of some massive beast, and farming tools hung from the walls, scythes, hammers, and rope that had served purposes far removed from agriculture. Jonathan Whitmore stood near a workbench, methodically rolling up his sleeves while Samuel paced near the far wall, his shadow dancing grotesquely in the lamplight. Between them, a wooden chair sat in the center of the space, its arms worn smooth by the desperate grip of countless hands. "Close the door behind you, Margaret," Jonathan said, without looking up from his preparations. His voice carried the casual tone of a man discussing the weather, but Margaret knew better than to be fooled by his calm demeanor. She pushed the heavy door shut, the sound echoing through the barn like the closing of a coffin lid. The air inside was stifling, thick with humidity and the promise of violence. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet whatever was coming with the dignity that no amount of brutality had managed to strip away. "You know why you're here," Samuel said, finally stopping his pacing to face her. His pale eyes glittered with anticipation, and Margaret could see the bulge of the flask in his jacket pocket. The brothers always drank before their sessions, claiming it helped them maintain their objectivity. "Yes, Master Samuel," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her. Jonathan finally looked up, his thin face split by a smile that held no warmth. "Good. Then we can dispense with the pretense." He gestured toward the chair. "Sit." Margaret remained standing. It was a small act of defiance, but in a world where she controlled nothing, even the smallest choice felt monumental. "I prefer to stand, Master." The smile vanished from Jonathan's face like smoke in a strong wind. "I wasn't asking, girl. I was telling." Still, Margaret didn't move. Something had shifted inside her during the walk from the slave quarters to the barn, a fundamental change in the architecture of her soul. She had spent years bending, yielding, surviving, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt final. Samuel stepped forward, his hand moving to the coiled whip that hung from his belt. Maybe she needs a reminder of what happens to uppity slaves. Oh, she'll get her reminder, Jonathan said, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper that Margaret had learned to fear above all else. But first, let's discuss this reading business. Where did you learn? Margaret's mind raced. The truth would implicate others, possibly even the memory of Master Whitmore's deceased daughter Emily, who had secretly taught several slaves to read before consumption claimed her at 17. Emily had been the one bright spot in Margaret's early years on the plantation, a girl who had seen slaves as human beings rather than property. "I don't know how to read, Master," Margaret said again, but this time her voice carried less conviction. Jonathan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Samuel, show her what we found in her cabin." Samuel reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, leather-bound book, the Bible that Emily had given Margaret years ago, hidden beneath a loose floorboard that had apparently been discovered. Margaret's heart sank as she recognized the worn cover, the pages she had read by candlelight in the depths of night, finding solace in words of deliverance and justice. Exodus chapter 21, Jonathan read, opening the book to a page marked with a pressed flower. Verse 26, "And if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake." He looked up at Margaret with mock curiosity. Interesting reading material for someone who claims not to know her letters. The trap had been sprung, and Margaret realized that this confrontation had been planned for longer than she had imagined. They had been watching her, waiting for the right moment to spring their evidence and justify whatever punishment they had already decided upon. "Emily taught me," Margaret said quietly, deciding that honesty might be her only remaining weapon. Before she died, Samuel's face darkened at the mention of his niece. "That little fool. We should have known she was filling slaves' heads with dangerous ideas. No wonder she died young, God's punishment for her sins." The casual dismissal of Emily's memory, the reduction of her kindness to sin, ignited something primal in Margaret's chest. Emily had been the closest thing to a friend she had ever known, a girl who had risked her father's wrath to teach slaves that they were more than property. "She was a good person," Margaret said, her voice rising slightly. "She saw us as human beings." Jonathan's hand moved faster than a striking snake, the back of his palm connecting with Margaret's cheek with a sound like a gunshot. The force of the blow sent her stumbling backward, her vision blurring as pain exploded across her face. "You will not speak of my niece with your filthy mouth," Jonathan snarled, his composure finally cracking. Emily was confused, misguided by northern propaganda. "But you took advantage of a child's innocence to corrupt yourself with ideas above your station." Margaret touched her cheek, feeling the warmth of blood where his ring had cut the skin. But instead of the familiar resignation that usually followed such violence, she felt something else rising within her, a cold, calculating fury that seemed to sharpen her vision and slow time itself. "Now," Samuel said, pulling the whip free from his belt, "let's discuss the consequences of education without permission." The leather unfurled with a whisper of promised agony, and Margaret knew that what was coming would be worse than anything she had endured before. The brothers had been building to this moment, using her literacy as an excuse to indulge their darkest impulses without fear of judgment from their peers. But as Samuel raised the whip and Jonathan moved to position himself for a better view, Margaret's eyes fell upon the workbench, where various tools lay scattered in the lamplight. Among them, a heavy claw hammer caught the flickering illumination, its steel head gleaming like a promise. "Please," Margaret said, allowing her voice to break slightly, playing the role they expected while her mind calculated distances and possibilities. "I'll burn the book. I'll never read again." "Oh, you'll burn it," Jonathan agreed, his smile returning. "But first, you're going to learn why slaves who get above themselves always fall the hardest." Samuel drew back his arm, the whip singing through the air. But Margaret was already moving. Years of backbreaking labor had given her a strength that her slight frame concealed, and desperation lent her speed that surprised even herself. Her hand closed around the hammer's handle just as the whip cracked through the space where she had been standing. Jonathan's eyes widened in shock as he realized what was happening, but his reflexes, dulled by years of unchallenged authority and Samuel's shared flask, were too slow. The hammer's claw end caught him in the temple with a wet, crushing sound that seemed to echo through the barn like thunder. Jonathan Whitmore, master of 300 slaves and terror of Jefferson County, crumpled to the dirt floor without even a cry of surprise. Samuel's mouth opened in a soundless scream of rage and disbelief, the whip falling from nerveless fingers as he stared at his brother's motionless form. Blood pooled beneath Jonathan's head, dark and thick in the lamplight, and Margaret realized with crystal clarity that she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. "You killed him," Samuel whispered, his voice hollow with shock. "You actually killed him." Margaret looked down at the hammer in her hand, its steel head now painted with her master's blood, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in her life, she had acted instead of endured, had chosen violence instead of accepting it. "Yes," she said simply, raising her eyes to meet Samuel's terrified gaze. "And now I'm going to kill you too." Samuel Whitmore's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally, for the first time in his privileged life, genuine fear. He stumbled backward, his boots slipping in the dirt as he tried to process the impossible scene before him: his brother's lifeless body and a slave holding the weapon that had ended the Whitmore dynasty's reign of terror. "You can't," he stammered, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. "You're just a slave. You can't kill white men. They'll hunt you down like a rabid dog." Margaret stepped over Jonathan's body with deliberate calm, the hammer still gripped firmly in her right hand. The weight of it felt natural now, like an extension of her will made manifest. "They'll hunt me anyway," she said, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed to fill the barn. "The moment they find his body, I'm a dead woman. So what do I have to lose?" Samuel's hand fumbled for the pistol he kept tucked in his waistband, but his fingers were shaking so violently that he couldn't manage to draw it cleanly. The flask in his jacket had done its work too well, clouding his reflexes and leaving him vulnerable in a way he had never imagined possible. "The others will hear," he said desperately, finally managing to pull the gun free. "The overseers, the house slaves, they'll come running." "No," Margaret replied, continuing her steady advance. "They know better than to interfere when you and your brother are disciplining slaves. They've learned to ignore the screams." The truth of her words hit Samuel like a physical blow. For years, he and Jonathan had cultivated an atmosphere of terror so complete that even the white overseers avoided the barn during their sessions. The isolation that had once protected their cruelest impulses now left Samuel utterly alone with the consequences of their actions. He raised the pistol with trembling hands, but Margaret was already moving. Years of dodging blows and anticipating violence had taught her to read the subtle shifts in posture that preceded an attack. She dove to the side just as the gun discharged, the bullet splintering the wooden wall behind where she had been standing. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, but Margaret knew it would be dismissed by anyone who heard it. The Whitmores often used firearms to intimidate their slaves, and a single shot would be attributed to another lesson in obedience rather than a struggle for survival. Samuel was frantically trying to reload when Margaret's shoulder caught him in the midsection, driving him backward into the wall with bone-jarring force. The pistol flew from his hands, clattering across the dirt floor and disappearing into the shadows beyond the lamplight. "Please," Samuel gasped, The wind knocked from his lungs. "I can give you money, papers. I can set you free." Margaret straightened slowly, the hammer raised above her head like an executioner's axe. "Free?" she repeated, her voice carrying a bitter laugh. "You think freedom is something you can give me? Something you can take away?" "Yes," Samuel said desperately. "I have the authority, you have nothing," Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through his pleas like a blade. "You never had anything except the accident of your birth and the willingness to use it to destroy others." The hammer fell with the inevitability of gravity, catching Samuel in the crown of his skull with a wet, crushing sound that seemed to reverberate through Margaret's bones. He dropped like a felled tree, his body convulsing once before going still beside his brother's corpse. Margaret stood in the sudden silence, her chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through her veins like liquid fire. The barn felt different now, no longer a chamber of horrors, but a tomb for the men who had made it so. The lamplight flickered across the scene, casting dancing shadows that seemed to celebrate the end of an era. But even as she savored the moment of victory, Margaret's practical mind was already working through the implications of what she had done. 2 white men were dead by her hand, and in the Kentucky of 1851, that was a crime that would bring down the full fury of the law and the lynch mob alike. She looked down at the bodies, noting how small they seemed in death, how ordinary. These men who had loomed over her life like malevolent gods were revealed now as nothing more than flesh and bone, as mortal and fragile as any slave they had tormented. Margaret set the hammer aside and began to work with the methodical efficiency of someone who had spent years performing tasks under the threat of violence. She dragged Jonathan's body to the center of the barn, then Samuel's, arranging them side by side like offerings on an altar of justice. From the tool rack, she selected a bone saw used for butchering livestock, its blade worn smooth by years of use. The irony was not lost on her. The Whitmores had always treated their slaves like animals, and now they would be processed like the cattle they so resembled in their moral emptiness. The work was gruesome, but necessary. Margaret had no illusions about her chances of escape if the bodies were found intact. But if the Whitmore brothers simply disappeared, if their remains were scattered and hidden, it might buy her the time she needed to reach the Ohio River and the promise of freedom beyond. She worked through the night, her movement steady and purposeful, despite the horror of her task. The bone saw whispered through flesh and sinew, reducing the masters of the plantation to manageable pieces that could be buried in the fields they had forced others to work. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret wrapped the last of the remains in burlap sacks weighted with stones from the barn's foundation. The blood-soaked dirt she scraped up and mixed with fresh soil, scattering it across the barn floor until no trace of violence remained. She cleaned the tools meticulously, returning each to its proper place on the rack. The hammer that had begun her revolution she kept, tucking it into the rope belt around her waist like a talisman of her newfound power. Finally, she took the oil lamps and splashed their contents across the barn's wooden walls. The structure was old and dry, perfect kindling for the fire that would erase the last evidence of the night's work. She struck a match and watched as flames began to lick hungrily at the oil-soaked wood. Margaret walked out of the burning barn and into the pre-dawn darkness, carrying the weighted sacks toward the cornfield, where she would bury the pieces of her former masters among the roots of the crops they had forced her to tend. Behind her, the fire grew brighter, painting the sky with an orange glow that would soon bring the entire plantation running. But by then, Margaret would be just another slave rushing to help fight the blaze, her face a mask of concern and confusion as she watched the barn that had housed so much suffering burn to ash and memory. The Whitmore brothers had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only questions and the growing legend of a slave woman who had dared to claim her freedom with blood and fire. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the morning air as Sheriff William Crawford surveyed the smoldering remains of the Whitmore tobacco barn. At 52, Crawford had seen his share of plantation fires. Most were accidents caused by careless handling of oil lamps or spontaneous combustion of dried tobacco leaves. But something about this scene felt different, wrong, in a way that made his weathered instincts prickle with unease. "When did you last see the masters?" Crawford asked Thomas Henley, the head overseer, a thin man whose nervous energy seemed to radiate from his wiry frame like heat from a forge. Henley wiped sweat from his brow despite the early morning coolness. "Yesterday evening, Sheriff. Master Jonathan and Master Samuel said they had business to attend to in the barn. That was around 8 o'clock, just after the evening bell." Crawford nodded, making notes in his leather-bound journal. "And no one saw them leave?" "No, sir. We all assumed they'd retired to the main house after their business was concluded." Henley's eyes darted away as he spoke, and Crawford caught the implication. The Whitmore brothers' nocturnal activities were an open secret among the plantation staff, though no one dared speak of them directly. "What about the slaves? Anyone acting suspicious?" Henley's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff, they're all acting suspicious. Whispering among themselves, looking scared, but that's nothing new around here." Crawford walked closer to the ruins, his boots crunching on charred wood and ash. The fire had burned hot and fast, consuming everything with an efficiency that seemed almost deliberate. He knelt and sifted through the debris with a stick, looking for anything that might explain the Whitmore's disappearance. "Sheriff Crawford?" The voice belonged to Dr. Marcus Webb, the county coroner, a portly man in his 60s who served the surrounding plantations. "I've examined the house and grounds. No sign of the brothers anywhere. Their horses still in the stable. Personal effects undisturbed in their rooms. It's as if they simply vanished into thin air." Crawford stood and dusted ash from his hands. In his 20 years as sheriff, he had learned that people didn't simply vanish. They were either hiding, running, or dead. Given the Whitmore's reputation and the growing tensions over slavery throughout Kentucky, any of those options seemed possible. "I want to question the slaves," Crawford announced. "All of them, starting with anyone who might have been near the barn last night." Henley's face paled. "Sheriff, that could take all day. We've got nearly 300 slaves on this plantation." "Then we'd better get started." The questioning began in the slave quarters, where Crawford set up a makeshift interrogation area under the shade of an ancient oak tree. One by one, the slaves were brought before him, field hands, house servants, children and elders. Most claimed to have been asleep when the fire started, awakened only by the shouts and commotion as the plantation mobilized to fight the blaze. Margaret was among the third group called forward. She approached with the same quiet dignity that had always marked her bearing, her hands folded calmly in front of her worn dress. Crawford studied her face as she stood before him, noting the fresh bruise on her cheek and the way she held herself with an almost regal composure despite her circumstances. "Name?" Crawford asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Margaret, sir." "Last name?" "Slaves don't have last names, Sheriff," she replied simply. Crawford made a note. "You're one of the field hands?" "Yes, sir. Cotton and tobacco mostly." "Where were you last night between 8 and midnight?" Margaret's expression didn't change. "In my cabin, sir. Sleeping. The work days are long." "Anyone who can verify that?" "Celia Washington shares my cabin. She can tell you I was there all night." Crawford nodded and made another note. Something about Margaret's calm demeanor struck him as unusual. Most slaves became nervous and deferential when questioned by white authorities, but she seemed almost peaceful. "You have any dealings with Master Jonathan or Master Samuel recently?" For the first time, Margaret's composure flickered slightly. "Master Jonathan spoke to me yesterday afternoon, told me to come to the barn after evening bell." Crawford's pen stopped moving. "And did you?" "No, sir. I was too tired from the day's work. I went straight to my cabin after supper." "That was disobedient of you." Margaret's eyes met his directly, something that made Crawford unconsciously lean back in his chair. "Yes, sir, I suppose it was." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the way she seemed to choose her words carefully. "You can read, can't you, Margaret?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the burned barn. Margaret's face remained impassive, but Crawford caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested he had struck close to something important. "No, sir, slaves aren't allowed to read." "That's not what I asked." Margaret was silent for several heartbeats before responding. "Master Jonathan thought I could read. He was displeased about it." Crawford felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to align in his mind. A literate slave, a missed appointment at the barn, and 2 missing masters. "What happened to your face, Margaret?" "I fell, sir. Clumsy of me." "When?" "Yesterday evening." Crawford closed his journal and leaned forward. "Margaret, I think you know more about what happened to the Whitmore brothers than you're telling me. If you help me find them, I might be able to ensure you're treated fairly." Margaret's laugh was soft, but carried an edge that made Crawford's skin crawl. "Treated fairly, Sheriff? By who? The next master who buys me? The overseer who takes over this plantation? The judge who decides my fate?" "The law protects everyone, Margaret. Even slaves have rights." "Do we?" Margaret asked, her voice carrying a weight of experience that made Crawford suddenly uncomfortable. "Tell me, Sheriff, what rights did I have when Master Jonathan decided to discipline me? What rights do any of us have when white men decide we need to be taught our place?" Crawford found himself without an answer. The law did protect slaves in theory, but the reality was far more complex. Masters had broad authority over their property, and the testimony of slaves was rarely accepted in court against white men. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Margaret. Do you know what happened to Jonathan and Samuel Whitmore?" Margaret stood quietly for a moment, her gaze fixed on something beyond Crawford's shoulder. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a strange serenity that raised the hair on the back of his neck. "I know they got what they deserved, Sheriff, and I know that sometimes justice comes from unexpected places." Before Crawford could respond, Margaret turned and walked away, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. He watched her go, a growing certainty settling in his mind that he had just spoken with either a witness to murder or the perpetrator herself. That evening, as Crawford prepared his preliminary report, word came from the neighboring plantations that several slaves had gone missing during the night. The Underground Railroad, which had been relatively quiet in Jefferson County, seemed to have suddenly sprung to life. Crawford stared out his office window at the darkening sky and wondered if the disappearance of the Whitmore brothers was connected to the sudden exodus of slaves. In his gut, he knew that Margaret held the key to both mysteries, but proving it would be another matter entirely. The hunt for the missing masters was about to become something much larger and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. 3 weeks had passed since the Whitmore brothers vanished, and Jefferson County buzzed with rumors that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed the brothers had been murdered by abolitionists from Ohio. Others whispered of divine retribution for their cruelties. But among the slave quarters of every plantation in the region, a different story was taking shape, one that spoke of a woman who had dared to strike back against her oppressors and lived to tell the tale. Sheriff Crawford sat in his office, surrounded by reports and witness statements that led nowhere. The investigation had consumed his days and haunted his nights, but he was no closer to solving the mystery than he had been 3 weeks ago. The burned barn had yielded no useful evidence, and the slaves he had questioned maintained their stories with a consistency that was either truthful or remarkably well coordinated. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Come in." Doctor Webb entered, carrying a small cloth bundle that he placed carefully on Crawford's desk. "I thought you should see this, Sheriff. One of my patients found it while plowing his north field." Crawford unwrapped the bundle to reveal a human finger, partially decomposed, but still recognizable. A gold signet ring bearing the Whitmore family crest clung to the bone. "Jonathan's ring," Crawford said grimly. "Where exactly was this found?" "About 2 miles north of the Whitmore plantation, near Willow Creek. The farmer said his plow caught on something buried about 3 feet down." Crawford studied the grisly evidence, his mind racing through the implications. "Any other remains?" "Not yet, but I suspect if we search the area thoroughly, we'll find more." The question is, how did pieces of Jonathan Whitmore end up scattered across the countryside? Before Crawford could answer, Deputy Marshal James Harrison burst through the door, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. 3 more plantations reported slave escapes last night. That makes nearly 50 runaways in the past 3 weeks." Crawford set the finger aside and reached for his hat. "Any pattern to the escapes?" "That's just it, Sheriff. There is a pattern. Every plantation that's lost slaves has reported the same thing. The runaways left behind crude drawings on their cabin walls, pictures of a woman holding a hammer." The 3 men exchanged glances, the significance of the symbol not lost on any of them. Crawford had kept his suspicions about Margaret to himself, but the evidence was mounting that his instincts had been correct. "There's more," Harrison continued. "I've been talking to overseers and masters throughout the county. They're all reporting the same thing. Their slaves are acting different, less submissive, more defiant. Some are refusing direct orders, and when punished, they just stare at their masters like they're not afraid anymore." Crawford felt a chill run down his spine. In a society built on the absolute subjugation of one race by another, the loss of fear was more dangerous than any weapon. "Have you located Margaret?" "That's the other problem, Sheriff. She's gone, disappeared sometime during the night, along with 5 other slaves from the Whitmore plantation. But here's the strange part. None of the other plantations are reporting her presence. It's like she vanished into thin air." Dr. Webb picked up the severed finger, examining it in the afternoon light streaming through the window. "Sheriff, I've been thinking about the condition of this remains. The decomposition pattern suggests the body was dismembered shortly after death, then buried in multiple locations. That takes knowledge, planning, and considerable physical strength, or desperation," Crawford added grimly. "Perhaps, but there's something else. I've been reviewing the medical records for the Whitmore plantation slaves. Margaret was treated several times for injuries consistent with severe beatings. The most recent was just 2 days before the brothers disappeared." Crawford absorbed this information, feeling the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. So she had motive, opportunity, and apparently the capability to dispose of the bodies. "But Sheriff," Harrison interjected, "even if she killed them, how is she inspiring slaves across the entire county? She's been gone for weeks." The answer came from an unexpected source. Old Moses, the elderly slave who served as an unofficial leader among the Whitmore plantation's remaining workers, appeared in the doorway of Crawford's office. His presence was so unusual that all 3 white men fell silent. "Begging your pardon, Sheriff," Moses said, his voice carrying the careful deference of a lifetime's practice, "but I heard you talking about Margaret." Crawford gestured for the old man to enter. "What do you know about her, Moses?" "I know she was special, sir. Different from the rest of us. She could read, write, think things through, and I know she suffered more than most under the master's hands. Do you know what happened to Jonathan and Samuel Whitmore?" Moses was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped in front of him. "I know they're gone, Sheriff. And I know that for the first time in my 70 years, I've seen slaves who aren't afraid to look white men in the eye." "Are you saying Margaret killed them?" "I'm saying Margaret showed us something we'd forgotten, Sheriff. She showed us that we're human beings, not property. And human beings don't have to accept being treated like animals." Crawford leaned forward in his chair. "Moses, if you know where she is—" "I don't know where she is, Sheriff. But I know where she's going. North. like all of us should have done years ago. And I know that every slave who hears her story is going to remember that freedom isn't something you ask for, it's something you take. The old man turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. Sheriff, you seem like a decent man. So I'll tell you something else. Margaret didn't just kill two masters that night. She killed the idea that we have to accept whatever white folks decide to do to us, and that idea is spreading faster than any fire you ever saw. After Moses left, the three white men sat in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Dr. Webb spoke. Sheriff, what are we dealing with here? A murderer or a revolutionary? Crawford stared out the window at the bustling streets of Jefferson County, where the normal rhythms of Southern life continued despite the undercurrents of change flowing beneath the surface. Maybe both, Doctor, maybe both. That night, as Crawford made his rounds through the county, he noticed changes that confirmed Moses's words. Slaves who had once stepped aside when white men approached now stood their ground. Overseers reported increasing difficulty maintaining discipline. And in the slave quarters of every plantation, crude drawings of a woman with a hammer appeared on walls, fence posts, and cabin doors. The legend of Margaret was spreading through the slave community like wildfire, carried by whispered stories and coded songs. She had become more than a person. She was a symbol of resistance, proof that the system of slavery was not as unbreakable as it appeared. Crawford knew that he was witnessing the beginning of something that would reshape the South, though he couldn't yet comprehend its full scope. The woman who had killed two masters in a tobacco barn had inadvertently lit a fuse that would burn through the foundations of the society he had sworn to protect. As he rode through the darkness, Crawford found himself wondering if Margaret was still alive, still moving north toward freedom, or if she had become something larger than life, a ghost haunting the conscience of a region built on human bondage. In the slave quarters, the spirituals took on new meanings that night. Songs of deliverance and freedom carried coded messages about a woman who had dared to strike back, who had shown that masters could bleed and die like any other men. The hammer had become a symbol of liberation, and Margaret's name was whispered like a prayer for justice. The hunt for the missing Whitmore brothers would continue, but Crawford increasingly understood that he was chasing more than a fugitive slave. He was pursuing the embodiment of an idea that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of Southern society, the radical notion that all human beings, regardless of color, possessed the inherent right to freedom and dignity. Margaret had vanished into legend, but her legacy was just beginning to reshape the world she had left behind. In the summer of 1851, a slave woman's desperate act of violence had planted the seeds of a revolution that would eventually consume the nation in civil war. The hammer had fallen, and nothing would ever be the same. Epilogue. Years later, when the Civil War had ended and the chains of slavery were finally broken, historians would search for the origins of the slave rebellions that had swept through Kentucky in the 1850s. They would find scattered references to a woman named Margaret, fragments of stories about a tobacco barn fire, and crude drawings of hammers carved into the walls of abandoned slave quarters. But the full truth of what happened that summer night in 1851 would remain buried with the bones of Jonathan and Samuel Whitmore scattered across the fields they had once owned. Margaret herself had vanished into the Underground Railroad, her fate unknown, but her impact undeniable. She had become what every oppressive system fears most, proof that the oppressed could fight back, could win, and could inspire others to follow their example. In striking down her masters, Margaret had struck a blow against the entire institution of slavery, showing that it was built not on natural law, but on fear, and that fear could be overcome. The legend of Margaret would outlive the Confederacy, outlive Jim Crow, and continue to inspire those who faced injustice with nothing but their courage and the tools at hand. She had shown that sometimes the most powerful weapon against oppression is the simple refusal to accept it any longer. In the end, Margaret's greatest victory was not the death of two cruel masters, but the birth of hope in the hearts of those who had forgotten they deserved to be free.